Major funding for this program has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding has been provided by the Alfred Yerzykovsky Foundation, the J.S. Johnson and Barbara P. Johnson Fund in the New York Community Trust, the Polish-American Congress, the Joyce Foundation, and the Friends of the Struggles for Poland. A complete donor list is available from WNET.
I'm Roger Mudd. On the 23rd of August, 1939, Adolf Hitler's foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, and Stalin's foreign minister, Molotov, signed a pact of non-aggression. The world was stunned. The agreement could have but one meaning. Poland was about to be invaded. A few months earlier, Britain had guaranteed Poland's independence. France was already committed to her defense, and now the world stood on the brink of war. 9 days after the pact was signed, German troops crossed the Polish frontier. 48 hours later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Second World War began. A German invasion was expected, but the Poles were not prepared for the sheer weight of machinery and firepower which was hurled against them. German tanks outnumbered Polish tanks 10-1. The German Air Force was 5 times the size of Poland's. For about 3 weeks, the Polish army was cut into smaller and smaller pieces by German thrusts. Polish units were isolated from each other, communications broke down, but the Poles kept on fighting against all odds. It should have been an easy victory for the Germans. It was not. Germany suffered more casualties in this conflict than in the longer conquest of France the following year. But the final results were never really in question. In the countryside, the Polish army was annihilated. Some units escaped Poland to fight on against Germany on other fronts. Some units retreated to Warsaw, where they made a final stand. Hitler ordered an aerial bombardment of the city. Warsaw was crushed beneath a blanket of bombs and artillery fire. The conquest of Poland was to be different from any of Germany's other conquests. It was Hitler's intention to destroy the Polish state once and for all. Part of its territory he intended to incorporate into the German Reich. The rest he intended as a temporary holding ground for a doomed people. In September 1939, it is said, Polish defenders pitted their cavalry against the massed tanks of the invading German army. Whether such a thing ever truly occurred is uncertain, but people believed it. It gave new form to a myth deeply rooted in the Polish national consciousness. The myth of the doomed romantic gesture. In Warsaw, there was desperation as the Germans closed in.
Well, air raids began. The army was there, so there were many horses. Women would go up to these fallen horses with sharp knives, and we'd cut out chunks of meat. And this helped us a great deal to live through those difficult days.
Pomagało bardzo w przeżyciu tych ciężkich dni.
I called all my officers together, and I told them that I'm afraid it can't be helped. There's been a decision to surrender Warsaw. We'll have to surrender arms and become prisoners of war. It's a moment I find moving. It brings a lump to my throat. At that, Captain Chick, commander of one of the squadrons, stood up and asked permission to speak. He said, the 3rd Squadron, and at that all the officers of the 3rd Squadron got up and stood to attention. The 3rd Squadron has decided not to surrender. We intend to charge the German lines. It was both a proud and a worrying moment for me. I said that this is not the end of the war, it's only the beginning, and that those who cannot accept defeat are not worthy of victory.
On September 1st, the Germans had attacked Poland from 3 sides at once. Their superiority in firepower, mobility, and air support was overwhelming. The Polish army's task had been to hold out for 15 days, by which time the British and the French were committed to intervene. The British and the French declared war on Germany, then did nothing. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The Germans and the Soviets had secretly agreed to divide Poland between them. By early October, it was done. In Kiev, capital of the Soviet Ukraine, demonstrations of national fervor greeted the incorporation of former Polish territories into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The majority of people in those regions were ethnically Ukrainian. Now they were filled with hope.
There was an atmosphere of expectation. The Ukrainians seemed to expect that there would be some sort of change, but they were quickly disappointed. Notable Ukrainian activists were arrested, just like the Poles. On the first day they came in, on the 17th they crossed the frontier, and on the 20th they entered Chemnieniec. Straight away on the first day, they arrested the district administrator, the mayor, the chief constable, and someone else, the chief prosecutor.
And they just woken us up and very politely said that they would like our father to go with them for questioning. And when my younger sister and I clung to him, they said, there is no need for farewells. You will see him in a few hours' time. We only want him for a few hours questioning. And we never saw him again. It was just the beginning of so many broken promises.
I was at home at the time, and suddenly my children's teacher ran into the house with my 2 children and said, "We must pack and go quickly into the hills, because people are being rounded up. We can't quite make out who, but some of the children are being called out by the authorities and are being driven away, with their parents or without. In a word, they are being driven somewhere, to the station." I grabbed the 2 children and said we'd better go into the hills, so that we're not here, because they may come for us. We put on our ski trousers and shoes, our sheepskins, and went into the Chemnieniec hills.
We came to the long line of trains and hordes of people that are being pushed into cattle trucks. There was such a shock after receiving all these promises of this cultural resettlement to be pushed into cattle truck when there was nothing, just a bunk stretching from one wall to the other, the small barred windows, the hole in the floor, which was supposed to be our toilet, and just some metal stove in the middle of this train for people with small children to cook something on. And after a few days we were put into different trains, which were, we realized, on wider lines, and those we knew are leading into depth of Russia.
We were caught. A gun. My son burst out crying, but he later explained that, well, you did tell us that it might do some good. That's how he explained himself. He really felt ashamed that he had burst into tears. And then the interrogations. For 3 days we were kept in a pigsty. Then we were moved to another one several kilometers away. More interrogations. Then they threw us over the frontier wires, and that was it. We went to Warsaw.
The Soviets considered Poles a potential source of resistance in their new territories. More than 1.5 million Poles were deported to Siberia, the Arctic, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Nazis incorporated a large swath of western Poland into the Greater Reich. Some of the cities there had substantial German minorities, the Volksdeutsch, many of whom greeted the invaders as liberators. Although Germans accounted for only 6.5% of the overall population of these territories, the Nazis made much of the claim that they were ancestral German lands.
Der große Raum im Osten des Reiches, der von der Weichsel durchflossen wird, ist seit vielen Jahrhunderten fruchtbarer Boden für die sich ausbreitende deutsche Kultur.
As part of the deal between the Nazis and the Soviets, these incorporated territories were to be repopulated with huge numbers of Volksdeutsch from areas now under Soviet control. To make room for them, over 1 million Poles were expelled by the Germans. Driven from their homes without forewarning, allowed to take only 20 kilograms, 44 pounds, of personal possessions, the Poles were packed into unheated boxcars and sent to a region the Germans set aside for the Poles, a region the Nazis referred to only as the General Gouvernement. Some of the deportees froze so hard to the boxcars that their bodies had to be removed with picks.
In the general government, we are under the very strong control, but at the same time in German plans, you know, it was a territory in which Poles temporarily were allowed to live, because final German goal, it was extermination of all Poles. After Jewish people and Gypsies, we were next in line. It was great German plan, you know, of Germanizing all Polish territories. And so we were doomed.
When Hitler took the salute at his victory parade in Warsaw on October 5th, 1939, he was lucky to be alive. A newly formed Polish resistance group had narrowly failed to blow up his car on its way to the reviewing stand. By the end of November, at least 100 resistance groups had sprung up. The legitimate Polish government, headed by General Sikorski, was based at this time in France. Supporters of the government in exile sought ways of ensuring that the resistance would submit to its authority.
That group was afraid that if the underground grows spontaneously by itself without, from the beginning, authority of the government in exile, first, things will get out of control, there will be too many losses, and secondly, the underground structure will have tendency to become independent from the government in France, in Angers, which Marian Bożencki wanted to avoid. I was to assure General Sikorski, if the delegate of the government, having your full confidence, is not appointed immediately, you run a risk that they will reduce you to a sort of an ambassador of Poland residing in France.
In Krakow, Hans Frank, Hitler's chief legal advisor, took up residence in the Wawel Castle to preside over a Nazi fiefdom. Warsaw was to be reduced to provincial status and was eventually to be remodeled as a small town for exclusive German habitation. All Polish libraries, museums, theaters, newspapers, and publishing houses were closed down. After an initial period in which Jews and the Polish intelligentsia were massacred in large numbers, the Jews suffered a life of constant harassment before being segregated into ghettos and finally transported to death camps. Most Poles left the Jews to their fate. The occupying authorities represented themselves as bringing cleanliness and efficiency to a backward Slavic country. But in fact, they repaired and reconstructed only what was useful to themselves: bridges, roads, railways, recreational facilities. factories were placed under German control. Those which could not be turned to war production were to be dismantled and their machinery sold for scrap. In 1940, Heinrich Himmler announced,
"No schools above elementary level may exist for the non-German population of the East. The aim of these elementary schools will be exclusively simple counting, at most up to 500, writing one's name, teaching that obedience to Germans, honesty, diligence, and courtesy are the law of God. I do not consider reading to be essential."
Of course, we realize, even as a young children, that they want us to just stay uneducated. And, well, they even said it in few words, that Poles are to just be laborers for Herrenvolk, for Germans. In Poland, there was a tradition of underground education since previous years of occupation. Many teachers developed the method how to prepare a course which will go parallel to the official course, how to prepare notes or how to hide things. They were ready.
To keep Poles ignorant of their tradition of underground resistance, the Germans banned the teaching of history. Only limited vocational training was available beyond the primary level. Nevertheless, during the occupation, 4 underground universities awarded degrees which would be internationally recognized after the war. And by 1942, an estimated 1.5 million children were receiving illegal education, for which those involved risked death.
Other night, you will not come, do not come. Only the day's dilapidated wall ends the earth from which footsteps have been wrenched. The rope tight with damp, the lament of pity squeals over the road. Like phantoms, we feast on dreams. Like monsters, we drink life. At night, the moon approaches like a sign, and, like the eye of a hanged man, drains away.
Nach den ersten russischen Getreidelieferungen trifft an den Übergangsstationen der deutsch-russischen Interessengrenze nun auch ein Ölzug nach dem anderen ein.
Supplies of raw material and grain which poured across the frontier from the Soviet Union, sustaining the Nazi war effort, brought no benefit to the inhabitants of the General Gouvernement. The richest areas of Poland, both agriculturally and industrially, had been absorbed into the Reich. The General Gouvernement was left to support a population swollen by enormous numbers of refugees. In addition, it was required to supply the needs of the occupying forces and to export food to the Reich. As a result, many Poles were brought to near starvation. Official rations for Poles, when they were available, amounted to only 669 calories a day. Jews were allowed only 184, slightly more than those in a single glass of milk. Without illicit supplies from the countryside, most people would have died of starvation.
People started to come to me from Warsaw, to begin with, on bikes. They could carry 50 kilos on a bike. They weren't well dressed. They didn't have any good means of transport. Their bicycles were falling apart, sir. They walked here from Warsaw. You know, they came on foot from Warsaw, and each took a few kilos of wholemeal flour or potatoes, sir. That's what they took. They were a picture of poverty. A picture of poverty. And so the wholemeal flour was only semi-ground wheat. The wheat was only half ground.
Ein Besuch in der Münze des Generalgouvernements.
The Polish Issuing Bank was the only state organization for which the word Poland was retained. It was meant to inspire faith in the currency. In fact, the Nazis had no concern for the economic health of the general gouvernement. Frontiers and tariff barriers protected the Reich from the effects of inflation, which was allowed to rise unhindered. Though black market food was essential to life, by 1943, the cost of 2 pounds of butter was equal to a month's wages.
Walking through the streets, sometimes you will hear whispers. Gold, gold, I will buy some gold. So black market was not only food, but many other things. Many families, when, for example, a father dead or ill or in prison, so family leaves selling whatever they have, books or furniture, pictures, valuables, and eventually everything was on the market.
Official jobs paid hardly anything. Only on the margins of the law could money be made.
What are you doing these days? I'm working in the town hall. And your wife, what about her? She's working in a paper store. And your daughter? She's a hospital receptionist. So how the hell do you manage to live? It's all right. My son's unemployed.
Kiedyś mi opowiadał jeden Belg.
A Belgian once told me, who for some reason was in Warsaw for a short time during the German occupation. He told me that in Warsaw, not even knowing the Polish language, he felt safe. He felt that the whole street was keeping watch over him. Adults, children, urchins, the serious-minded. He felt safe.
The Poles looked out for each other as Nazi arrests continued.
Jechaliśmy kiedyś tramwajem przepełnionym po Brzegi.
We were once traveling in a tram, crowded to the brim, when suddenly the tram slowed down a bit, and the conductor, looking all around, said to nobody in particular, just so, into the air, "Anybody who isn't quite you-know-what should get off. At Złota, there's a roundup."
Nic więcej nie powiedział.
He didn't say anything else, but the tram was empty in a flash, and it arrived empty at the place. They didn't manage to catch anybody.
Arbitrary arrests and roundups were part of everyone's life. By late 1942, a secret Polish state was resisting Nazi rule. Its military wing, the Home Army, worked alongside a full civil administration which was theoretically responsible to the government in exile now in London. The Nazis denied the Poles access to printing equipment and paper, but to no avail. By the end of 1939, there were already 18 clandestine newspapers published in Warsaw alone. By 1943, there were 190, among them 16 literary periodicals. The Home Army's Information Bulletin first appeared on November the 5th, 1939. It was published regularly with a circulation of 45,000 copies throughout the occupation. Despite the constant risk of arrest and execution, the Polish resistance came to be the largest and most elaborate national underground movement in Europe. The Nazis were unable to stop it.
Someone grabbed me by the arms from the back and said in German, "Polizei, Polizei." And they said, "Alte Hexe," that is, "You old witch. You don't know what the Gestapo is. You'll soon find out what the Gestapo is." Then, straight to headquarters. In the pocket of my suit, right next to the seam, I had a tiny roll of paper rolled like a squashed cigarette, where I had written in my own private code, based on associations, a list of how to reach various members of the underground leadership during Easter, because this was Good Friday.
Dojścia do komendy głównej w czasie Wielkiej Nocy, bo to był Wielki Piątek. I badanie.
First of all, they searched me. This German was sitting in uniform and playing Wagner, and he asked me if I liked Wagner. I didn't answer him. He took my personal details. I sat down. There was an SS man standing in the doorway with a gun. Gradually, I felt that, yes, it's still here. They haven't pulled it out. I have to get rid of it. When he turned round for a moment, I took the paper out. I put it in my mouth. And there I was sucking it for hours to make it into a ball so I could swallow it. I'm very bad at swallowing. I can't even swallow a headache pill without water.
Nie umiem proszka od bólu głowy połknąć. No, ale trudno, trzeba.
The Nazis liked to take snapshots of their own activities for the family album. They sent these for processing to Polish druggists who produced extra prints to be smuggled abroad. The world was made aware of the nature of the new order in Poland. General Bor Komorowski later wrote in his memoirs,
Once my wife Renia, with our child in the baby carriage, passed Senatorska Street, where an execution had just taken place. The corpses had already been carried away, but blood was splashed all over the pavement, and bits of brain were sticking to the walls. People were kneeling all around, and in a few seconds the whole place was covered with red and white flowers and burning candles. Flowers were put in every bullet hole in the wall. Renia stopped to pray. German police appeared, and she made off. When she looked back, they were shooting and beating people up. All in vain, for after a moment, the crowd was back again, and new flowers and new candles had appeared.
No i któregoś pięknego dnia przychodzi do mnie mały.
One beautiful day, my little son comes to me and says,
Wy nie macie
"You haven't got any weapons?" "We have, but not many."
I amunicji wam brak.
"And you're short of ammunition?" "We're short."
No to dlaczego nie macie?
"So why don't you have them?"
Dlatego, że
I said, "My dear, because they don't sell them in the shops, and the Germans don't want to hand them over to us.
Ale można.
But they can be found." "So, have you found any?" And at that, he puts his hands into his pockets and takes out 2 handfuls of rifle bullets. "Where did you get those from?" "I dug them up."
Wygrzebałem.
Aufbau im Osten. Das Stickstoffwerk Moschice im Generalgouvernement wird wieder in Betrieb genommen.
Despite the draconian discipline under which Poles worked in German-run industries, some Polish clerks and foremen managed to falsify their order books to divert essential materials to the Home Army. Nitrates for fertilizers were stolen to make explosives.
W 1942 roku postanowiliśmy uczcić imieniny Hitlera w sposób...
In 1942, we decided to celebrate Hitler's name day in a fitting manner. We falsified an order from the governor of the Warsaw district, Fischer, to all large factories working for the war industry. The workers were to be granted a special day off, for which they would receive full pay. We sent out the notices and distributed them in such a manner that they were received by the factories just before the end of the preceding workday, and therefore couldn't be annulled. Thus the factory directors announced, "Tomorrow you have the day off." Workers didn't clock in about 30 large factories. In Warsaw, in Pruszków, in Radom, about 40 factories didn't work. In Warsaw, the district governor appealed to the people on the streets to the public address system, saying that it was untrue, a forged document. Of course, that did no good. The workers didn't go to work, and several thousand, about 20,000, had a holiday for Hitler.
Newspapers, all controlled by the Nazis, became a target for minor sabotage by the Poles.
Scooters for Germans wishing to leave Poland for sale at Nazi Party headquarters. Jewish jewelry, guaranteed cleaned of blood. Rest homes for SS, Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka. Crematorium facilities available.
Ludność Warszawy, tak jak i innych okupowanych miast,
In Warsaw, the same as in other occupied towns, there was no proper theatre or anything. There were only those entertainments which the Germans wanted to give us. And the Germans wanted the worst possible. Vulgar, stupid, badly acted, you name it. And on top of that, the money went towards supplies for the German army. We diffused awful smells, garlicky smells. And of course, we spread the word that it was, well, poison gas, and so on. What didn't we do? Nothing helped. They went, and no doubt they'll always go in such conditions. We gave up the struggle over cinemas, because it was a waste of our time.
Campaigns against going to the movies formed part of what was called the Little Sabotage. It was a war of symbolism, an attempt to affirm a Polish identity in lawless and fearful times.
Let us assume that 1 million Poles were organized in underground organizations. But 31 million did not belong to the underground. So I prepared the so-called Code of Behavior of Good Pole. And in order to secure the execution of this instruction, I organized approximately 10 underground courts, authorized even to pronounce death sentence. So mostly were those Poles who agreed to serve as a Gestapo agent were sentenced to death, then blackmailer. For instance, I gave special instruction that Poles who blackmail Jews, in hiding, are to be sentenced to death too.
On June 22nd, 1941, Germany broke her alliance with the Soviet Union and invaded regions under Soviet control. Despite reports of a German military buildup, reports which had reached Moscow from the Polish underground by way of Britain, the Soviet Union was ill-prepared for the Nazi attack. As the Wehrmacht advanced rapidly, the Nazis believed they were near their long-term goal, the opening up of vast territories for German colonization. The Nazis planned to resettle up to 20 million Poles in Siberia. 3 or 4 million would be reclassified as Germans, and the rest exterminated.
Let the Poles never forget that they must blame themselves for their fate. They have no historical mission whatever in this part of the world. If they had such a mission, God would have blessed them.
So stated Governor Hans Frank. A pilot scheme was launched in November 1942. The populations of nearly 700 Polish villages in the Zamość district in eastern Poland were to be expelled and replaced by German settlers from Bessarabia on the Black Sea.
No one slept. We were all on our guard. We could only see the flashes. Nearby, there was a place, Szparowa Góra, and the cars came from there. My father said expulsions were about to begin. He was sure. But at the very moment he was talking to my mother, there was a thud on the door to open up. My father went and opened the door, and the Germans hit him in the chest with a rifle butt. We arrived in Zamość. The gate was wide open for us. We entered there with all our possessions and went into a barrack. Children up to the age of 14, even those as young as 6 weeks, were taken away. When these children were snatched away, and their mothers didn't want to hand them over, the Germans hit the parents. And then they started to hit the children. And they hit them really hard.
zaczęli bić dzieci. Także bardzo dużo dzieci, 3-letnią takie.
A lot of the children, even a 3-year-old girl, were thrown into the mud, even into the cesspit. They killed them. They took them by the legs and struck them against the corner of the barrack. And the mothers, after this, I suppose, were frightened that their children might come to greater harm with them. And the children were taken away and kept in other barracks. But gradually, they were taken away to Warsaw and Siedlce.
Wywozili pod Warszawę do Siedlc.
The plan was that children taken from their parents in Zamość were to be screened for desirable racial characteristics. Those showing evidence of Aryan blood were to be sent to the Reich for Germanization. In practice, most ended up in special children's concentration camps like the one in Lodz. Many died on the journey. Reports published in the Information Bulletin alerted the public to what was happening, and a number of the children were saved. Groups of Polish women waited for hours at railway stations to buy them back from the Nazi guards, but most were never seen again. The parents, meanwhile, were sent to the Reich or to concentration camps, many to Auschwitz.
It grew light outside. There were whistles. We heard calls. It was for roll call. And we saw some kind of shadows emerge. Not people, inhuman forms in that light, shriveled, unlike people.
For people not selected for the gas chambers, life expectancy in Auschwitz was approximately 3 months.
Next to the block, there was a whole pile of bowls, but there were also various rags. And some of the bowls had been defecated in, as there was an epidemic and awful dysentery. People had diarrhea. Some of the women took bowls and wiped them because there was no means of washing, saying that they had to take some food. My mother asked me, should she take a bowl for my food, but I told her I didn't want any, and she didn't take one. We didn't eat anything on the first or the second day, but on the third day we did. They lined us up stark naked along these cold stoves, which ran the length of the block. These brick stoves, which were rarely lit, completely cold. And we stood naked, and they made a selection according to who had this little triangle, part of a star. The Jewish women had a little triangle tattooed next to their number. And if you didn't have this, then raus, raus, back to those rats that were running around below. And in our presence, they put these Jewish women onto trucks and drove them to the death block. There was this death block. There were so many of them crowded there. They stood, sat, lay, that it was impossible to know how they all fitted in.